The Dance of the Dragons was supposed to be a war for the Iron Throne. But after everything that happened in Season 3, it is becoming harder to believe that anyone can truly win this war. Rhaenyra has fought for years to claim the throne, yet the closer she gets to power, the more everything around her begins to collapse. And if Season 4 follows the tragic direction established by the story, Rhaenyra's eventual death could become the moment that finally reveals the truth about the Targaryen Civil War. The throne was never worth the price. Rhaenyra enters the final season of House of the Dragon, carrying something far heavier than a simple claim to the Iron Throne. She is carrying the deaths of her children, the destruction of her family, the betrayal of people she once trusted, and the growing realization that every victory in this war comes with another terrible cost. What began as a political dispute over succession has become something much darker. It has become a war where almost every major character has already lost something they can never get back. And that is exactly why the possibility of Rhaenyra's death matters so much. The Rhaenyra we see now is not the same young princess who once believed that becoming queen could bring stability to Westeros. In the beginning, the throne represented responsibility. It represented her father's trust in her. It represented the future she believed she could build for her children. But war has changed the meaning of that throne. It is no longer simply a symbol of leadership. It has become the center of a machine that keeps demanding sacrifice. One person dies, another takes their place, and the war continues. Season 3 pushed that idea even further. Jacaerys was already lost earlier in the season, removing Rhaenyra's named heir and forcing the next generation into a conflict they did not create. The Battle of Tumbleton brought even more devastation, while the political situation around Rhaenyra became increasingly unstable. By the end of the season, the Greens were not simply disappearing. Aegon survived, Aemond remained a major threat, and the surviving dragons continued to make the war more unpredictable. Tech radar. This is important because Rhaenyra cannot simply assume that capturing King's Landing means the war is over. A city is not the same thing as a kingdom, and controlling the Iron Throne is not the same thing as controlling the people sitting beneath it. The small folk have already suffered enormously. Food shortages, violence, fear, and political instability have turned King's Landing into a pressure cooker. The people do not necessarily care about the technical argument over who has the better claim. They care about surviving another day. That creates one of the biggest dangers for Rhaenyra. She may technically become closer to victory while politically becoming weaker. That contradiction is at the heart of her story. The more desperate she becomes to secure her claim, the more ruthless decisions she may be forced to make. And every ruthless decision creates another person who has a reason to hate her. This is where the dragons become even more important. For generations, the Targaryens were able to maintain their power because dragons made rebellion almost impossible. But the Dance of the Dragons is turning that advantage against them. The more dragons enter the war, the more destruction spreads across Westeros. And when ordinary people begin to understand that these creatures can burn entire communities in moments, the dragons stop looking like symbols of divine royal authority. They start looking like weapons. That is why the Dragon Pit and the anger of the small folk are so important to the larger story. The Targaryens built their political power around fear of dragons, but the war is gradually teaching people that dragons can be killed too. And once people stop believing the royal family is untouchable, the entire system begins to crack. Rhaenyra's possible downfall, therefore, does not need to come from one enormous mistake. It can be the final result of dozens of smaller decisions made during years of war. Then there is Aegon. His story is almost the perfect mirror image of Rhaenyra's. He began the war as a king surrounded by political power, but he has been physically and emotionally destroyed by the conflict. Yet surviving such devastation could make him more dangerous, not less. By the end of Season 3, Aegon has survived circumstances that should have ended his story, and his return creates another major problem for Rhaenyra. The season has also moved Aegon and Aemond toward a renewed alliance, meaning the Green cause is far from finished. Tech radar Aegon does not need to become the perfect king. He only needs to remain alive long enough for Rhaenyra's position to collapse. And Aemond is even more dangerous because his ambitions are larger than simply protecting the Greens. With Vhagar behind him, he possesses the kind of destructive power that can change the battlefield in minutes. Then comes the next generation. Aegon III is perhaps the most important person to consider when looking beyond Rhaenyra's story. Because if Rhaenyra dies, the war does not suddenly disappear. Someone has to inherit the consequences, and that child would inherit a kingdom that has been broken by his own family. He would not grow up hearing stories about the glory of dragons. He would grow up surrounded by the consequences of them. That is what makes the dance so tragic. The people fighting for the throne believe they are fighting for their family's future, but they may actually be destroying the very future they are trying to protect. And this leads to the question Season 4 now has to answer. If Rhaenyra finally gets everything she wanted, but loses almost everyone she loved along the way, can that still be called victory? Because the throne may be waiting for her, but Westeros may no longer be waiting to accept her. And if those two things become impossible to reconcile, that is when the story could take its darkest turn. One of the most important details people can overlook is that Rhaenyra's downfall is not simply about whether someone can defeat her in battle. It is about whether the political system surrounding her can survive the war. That distinction changes everything. The Targaryens have always treated dragons as the ultimate guarantee of power. But Season 3 has shown the opposite. Dragons are now becoming harder to control, and dragon riders who were once useful pieces on a political board have developed their own motivations. Ulf and Silverwing are an obvious example of this growing instability. Hugh Hammer and Vermithor represent another dangerous development. Once ordinary people gain access to Targaryen-level power, the royal family can no longer assume that dragons automatically obey the traditional hierarchy. The weapon has escaped the hands of the people who created the system. And that could become devastating in Season 4. The hidden meaning is that the Targaryens are losing control at exactly the moment they need it most. Rhaenyra might have powerful allies. Aegon might have supporters. Aemon might have Vagar. But none of that guarantees stability. The dragons themselves can become part of the chaos. And then, there is the Iron Throne. The throne has always been presented as something worth fighting for. But House of the Dragon increasingly treats it as a symbol of sacrifice. Characters lose their children, their marriages, their friendships, and eventually their lives while chasing control of a chair. That is the irony at the center of the entire story. Everyone believes the Iron Throne gives them power, but the war repeatedly demonstrates how much power the throne takes from them. Rhaenyra's potential death would therefore have a much larger meaning than simply removing the main character. It would complete the transformation of the throne from a symbol of destiny into a symbol of destruction. And the strongest hidden detail may be the future of the dragons themselves. The Targaryens may technically survive the dance, but their greatest advantage will not survive it in the same form. The dragons are being consumed by the conflict, and the family is destroying the very creatures that made its dynasty almost impossible to challenge. By the end, the Targaryens may still possess the throne, but they will no longer possess the overwhelming power that once made the throne secure. That is the real tragedy hiding underneath Rhaenyra's story. So, what could actually happen to Rhaenyra in Season 4? If the adaptation continues broadly along the path of fire and blood, it is possible that her final fate will become one of the most brutal moments of the entire series. But it is important to separate what the source material establishes from what the television adaptation may change. House of the Dragon has already altered events, timelines, and character motivations, so the exact execution cannot be treated as guaranteed. Still, the direction is extremely difficult to ignore. One possibility is that Rhaenyra's greatest enemy will not be Aegon or Aemond alone. It could be the collapse of King's Landing itself. If the city turns against her, Rhaenyra could find herself trapped inside the very capital she fought so hard to control. And if the small folk become convinced that the ruling family is responsible for their suffering, the Iron Throne becomes almost impossible to defend politically. This could create the perfect environment for a final betrayal. Another possibility is that Rhaenyra's death becomes the consequence of her inability to trust anyone around her. She has spent years watching people betray her, and the war has taught her that hesitation can be fatal. That mindset could eventually make her vulnerable because every new threat looks like another conspiracy. And there is a fascinating parallel here with Aegon. Both rulers have been damaged by the war. Both have become increasingly desperate. Both believe survival justifies increasingly extreme decisions. The difference is that the war may eventually destroy both sides, even if one person technically wins. Then there is Demon. His relationship with Rhaenyra has always been built from a mixture of love, ambition, loyalty, and darkness. If he reaches a final confrontation with Aemond, that conflict could have enormous consequences for Rhaenyra's future. It is possible that Daemon's final choices will not simply be about defeating his enemy. They could determine whether Rhaenyra survives long enough to see the war end, and the Aemon versus Daemon conflict could become one of the most important turning points in the final season. Both men are products of the same Targaryen culture. Both have embraced violence. Both are tied to enormous dragons, and both have allowed the war to become personal. If they finally collide, the result could remove two of the most dangerous figures from the board at once. But that still would not end the war. That is the key. The dance does not stop because one powerful character dies. It keeps moving. New alliances form. New leaders appear. Children inherit their parents' enemies. The surviving factions continue fighting over a kingdom that has already been devastated. So, if Rhaenyra dies, the biggest question will not simply be, who killed her? The bigger question will be, who benefits from the empty throne? Aegon could become the symbol of green survival. Aegon III could become the symbol of Rhaenyra's legacy. The remaining dragons could become the final weapons, and the small folk could become the one force neither side can completely control. That is why Rhaenyra's death, if the adaptation follows that broad direction, could become the moment when the entire meaning of the war changes. Season 4 is confirmed as the final season, so the story now has very little room for another long political reset. The remaining characters are moving toward the endgame, and the final chapter will have to resolve the Targaryen civil war, while showing what remains of the dynasty afterward. People.com, that means every surviving dragon matters. Every alliance matters. Every betrayal matters. And Rhaenyra's position may become increasingly unstable as the consequences of the war finally catch up with her. The most interesting possibility is that the final season does not present Rhaenyra's downfall as a simple victory for Aegon. Instead, it could show both sides losing something they can never recover. If Rhaenyra falls, Aegon does not suddenly inherit a peaceful kingdom. He inherits the ruins. If Aemon falls, the Greens do not suddenly become safe. They lose one of their greatest weapons. If the dragons die, the Targaryens lose the foundation of their power. And if the small folk rise, neither side can simply command them back into submission. That is why the final image of this war could be far more haunting than another giant dragon battle. It could be the Iron Throne standing there, after almost everyone who wanted it has been destroyed. A chair surrounded by blood. A dynasty technically victorious, but permanently weakened. And a young generation forced to inherit the consequences. If the show follows that tragic direction, Rhaenyra's death would not be the end of the story. It would be the moment the story finally reveals what the war was really about. Not who deserved the throne, not who had the strongest dragon, but how much a family can destroy before there is nothing left worth ruling. Season 4 is now heading toward the final chapter of the Dance of the Dragons, and Rhaenyra's possible death could become the emotional center of that ending. But the biggest twist may be that even her death would not produce a true winner. The Iron Throne could survive while the Targaryen dynasty around it is permanently broken. So, now the question is yours. Do you think Rhaenyra's death will be the final proof that the Iron Throne was never worth fighting for? Or do you think the show could change her fate completely? Share your theory in the comments, because the final season could still surprise us.